Yes, good afternoon to the Sportsfan Radio panel. And I thought we'd start today, given that we've got Dan back on the panel, with asking him whether he thinks that the current NCAA model can survive. And if it can, where does he see it going? And if it can't, what does that mean for the college athletes? Good place to start.
Yeah, nothing, Mark, like a big hitter for me right off the top of the show here. College athletics, as I know, is more unique to the States than it is down in Australia. But, it really is an important aspect of society here in the United States. College sports is continuing to go through a massive transformation. A couple of years ago, the NCAA created what they had called as the Constitution Committee, and then they rolled into the Transformation Committee to try to update a lot of things relative to the NCAA. On one hand, college athletics is thriving. The number of students participating in college sports continues to set records. Graduation rates, which is the most important thing that we do, trying to get these athletes a degree, something you can't take away from them, continues to rise amongst all student athletes. However, at the same time, the opportunities, particularly those for student athletes participating in women's and Olympic sports, are under increasing legal pressures and legislative pressures that threaten to upend the opportunities at schools like those within the Big West that don't have the massive football revenues coming in. You hit it at the top, Mark. I mean, can it survive? I mean, college sports, it has to modernize in so many ways. Student athletes deserve to benefit from the name, image, and likeness, something that we can dive into here. I'm on the name, image, and likeness working group for the NCAA, and we're working aggressively to try to improve that space for student athletes. Literally things that we've created as part of this transformation process included enhanced benefits for the student athletes, completion, scholarship protections, post-participation medical coverage for all Division I student athletes. And in fact, starting in 2024, there'll be post-eligibility injury insurance for all student athletes, Division I through Division III. So there's a lot of good things going there, but the challenges that the NCAA faces, not only obviously with the media pressures that you continue to read about, the stories that make it, but there's disparate state laws and impending, particularly court cases and federal activity on institutions like the Big West. I mean, we could dive into those as well, but just give you a sense in name, image, and likeness alone, which is somewhat new over the last couple of years in the NCAA, where student athletes can make money off their name, image, and likeness. There's 30 different state laws in the United States. Out of the 50 states, more than 30 different laws on name, image, and likeness, which has created an unbelievable challenge, not only for the NCAA, but for coaches across the country trying to recruit student athletes and what they're allowed to do and how much they're allowed to offer. And as I've continued to say, name, image, and likeness is supposed to be pay for work, not pay for play. And it really has created a free agency system in college athletics, Mark. But, that kind of gives you a little bit of the overview as to where we're at. I'll be more than happy to take this any direction you want to take it.
Dan, can I just ask, this I think arises something we spoke about when you were on a show a couple of years ago, I think, about a Supreme Court decision, which basically said that, the name, image, likeness ought to be able to be productive of income. And it's not inconsistent with the fact that they're not working as athletes, not running for it. But isn't, and we wondered how far this would go. And my thought at the time was it won't go very far, because really name, image, likeness has been in American law forever and just seemed to be correcting what I saw as a wrong that the colleges were inflicting on the students. But it seems to have gone a lot further than that by what you're saying.
Yeah, it really has. I mean, the NCAA prohibited it because obviously the boosters, the recruiting opportunities that were out there potentially for name, image, and likeness. That again, the whole premise of name, image, likeness is that you're getting paid to work. You're getting paid to post something on social media or do a commercial spot promoting the local car dealership or running a camp for kids to teach them how to run a sport, not being paid to play, where they're being recruited and being provided hundreds of thousands of dollars to play quarterback at the University of Alabama or some other major institution that has that resource. So that's what the NCAA tried to prevent and did prevent over the years. But now that door's opened, they're finding that there's a lot of pay for play in the system.
So is the litigation basically arising from that Supreme Court decision to enforce their name, image, likeness protection, or is the litigation going further than that now, where they're actually trying to get pay for play?
It's going a little bit farther, Judge. Two of the bigger cases that are out there are what they call the Johnson case versus the NCAA, which basically is trying to set up that student athletes should be paid like an employee, that student athletes should be declared employees and being paid an hourly wage or a salary to be able to participate in their sports, plus all the scholarships and everything else that goes along with what they get as a student athlete. But the other one is what they call the House Oliver case versus the NCAA, which is really retroactive name, image, or likeness, particularly for it's roughly a 4-year, go 4 years back from 2021 when the law became effective. They want to try to create a class suit that would provide all those student athletes that participate 4 years prior to 2021 to be able to get name, image, or likeness, which could be, they're estimating billions of dollars in potential revenue there. The plaintiffs are throwing out there. So it really is. Those are the two bigger ones that are out there. It's not necessarily saying that you shouldn't do name, image, or likeness, because I think the NCAA, we've all agreed that this is something that's good for student athletes moving forward. It's really going back and looking back at those that may have missed those opportunities.
So, Dan, you've not only got those actions against the NCAA, but they've also got some other headwinds in that in the last show, we spoke about the realignment of conferences. Now, as the overseer of college sport, the NCAA must be worried when one of its Power 5 conferences, the Pac-12, suddenly is going to run into a position where it no longer exists. So how does the NCAA try and negotiate or chart a course so that all the colleges have a chance to be in a conference where they can compete properly?
That's the challenge, Mark. They really don't have that authority. I mean, you could determine as an institution whether you want to be Division I, which is the highest level of college athletics, which requires a certain number of scholarships per sport. You could choose to be Division II, which is a small middle level division, which requires a smaller number of scholarships, or Division III that doesn't offer scholarships at all. So any institution can determine what level of NCAA participation that they want to participate in. Obviously, the best known institutions in sport in the United States is at the Division I level, and those at the FBS, which is called the Football Bowl subdivision level, that has major college football, are the ones that have the greatest resources, the biggest broadcast revenue contracts out there. I mean, the Big Ten recently renegotiated their contract for over $1 billion in that respect. I mean, the money is significant at that level versus the Big West, which doesn't generate anywhere near that size contract. I mean, we're a multi-year contract just for a couple $1 million. So it kind of gives you a sense of what that revenue is coming at that level. And it has created vast disparity in the various levels of Division I, those that have and those that have not. But we all choose to compete at that Division I level. Now, the Pac-12, I think it was a 108-year-old conference that is probably having one of their best football seasons ever right now. Most notoriety, University of Colorado, Deion Sanders, coaching there. University of Colorado's in the Pac-12 this year. USC, teams that we talked about potentially winning the national championship last week on last week's show, all playing in the Pac-12 this year. So they did what they needed to do. They've improved their competitiveness, but the league is basically going to break up after this year, given that most of their schools decided to go to the Big 12, the Big 10, or now the ACC. So an institution can determine where they want to participate. The NCAA is a voluntary organization. It's a membership organization. You can choose to participate in it or not. And anybody that wants major college athletics participates at the NCAA Division I level.
And apart from the conferences being in competition, if you like, with each other, within the conferences themselves, it seems to me that there's tension between the various sports. For instance, what we call gridiron, you call football, I would imagine dominates in all sorts of ways that the crowds They have amazing stands, stadia, the television. It seems to be that football dominates the conferences. I just wonder if that's right, and if so, to what extent does that sport dominate?
It dominates. It's significant, Judge, and it really is a situation. If you're playing at the major level, the FBS level of college football, particularly those that what we call the Power 5 level conferences, which would be the ACC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Southeastern Conference, which is the SEC, and the Pac-12. Those are what are considered the major college football conferences. Now, as we talked about a minute ago, Judge, each of those 5 conferences have negotiated major broadcast agreements that the ESPN, CBS, Fox, NBC are paying hundreds of millions of dollars per year to many of those conferences, if not all 5 of those conferences. And each of those conferences are paying out $30 to $80 million per year to their institutions. So again, as we talked about the Big West level, we're Division I, but we're not, nowhere near that because we don't have major football in the Big West. We don't have football in the Big West. But Judge, when you're talking about $1 billion TV contract with the Big Ten, with their Fox deal, their ESPN deal, and their Big Ten network, the estimate is it's an 80-20 split. 80% of that broadcast contract is because of football. The 20% that's remaining is the other sports, which men's basketball is probably the bigger part of that 20% remaining, with women's basketball and women's volleyball probably just very small percentages there. But they call it the 80-20 rule. 80% of those broadcast agreements are because of football.
Is there also
just jump in if I could? Sorry to jump in. I watched that Colorado State match, and the fanaticism in the stands, we've never seen anything like it. We can't let that go. But surely that's just the top of the iceberg, or tip of the iceberg, in terms of the real picture that's happening.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, that last year you could have bought University of Colorado football tickets. I think it was $222 for season tickets, which would have got you into 6 or 7 football games last year. That Colorado State game, I think, was going for over $500 per ticket. So it kind of gives you a sense when you brought in Deion Sanders, you tried to elevate the program. You created, I mean, those first 3 games, it was the biggest story in sport here in the United States. And obviously you're watching it over there in Australia as well. Biggest story out there, going 3-0 when they only won 1 game out of 12 last year. But the amount of money that's coming in, just as we talked about the broadcast agreements, I think he promoted a new sunglass line last week, Paul, on the pregame show. And I think it was 72,000 pairs of sunglasses were sold during the game. And I think they estimated that Deion made like $2 million just during that game because of the licensing rights for his sunglass line. So again,
he might have got some tips from the local businessman, John Elway.
I mean, you talk about fanaticism. That's exactly what college football does. I mean, each institution only plays 12 or 13 games a year. And you're only talking 135 total, really 65 colleges and universities at the Power 5 level. That's all there is. So that really shows you when the broadcast agreements are being negotiated, they are putting all that money towards those 65 to make sure that all day long on Saturday, those games are being broadcast.
Dan, the other thing about the college system is that, as I understand it, most of the Olympic athletes come from colleges. And that's one of the big differences with Australia. We just don't have our system is very like the English system. But is that if that's right, obviously the Olympics don't include football or gridiron, and they really don't include basketball. I mean, the basketballers don't just play for the Olympics. I mean, it's good to get in the team, but they obviously got the NBA. But for some sports, the Olympics are the pinnacle of their sport. And I just wonder whether there's tensions within the conferences about enough money being funneled into what I call the Olympic sports.
It's really not. It's a challenge, Judge. There's not much money coming in to the Olympic sports. I mean, again, the money that funnels in from those Power 5 levels, that money goes into scholarships and facilities and benefits for all student athletes within their programs. But again, because I'm the commissioner of the Big West, I know the resources our institutions have generally come from student fees, not much from the NCAA or the conference broadcast agreement. So it really is upon the institutions. And you're correct. The college side of college sports really feeds our Olympic movement. I mean, the Big West, men's volleyball, water polo, both men's and women's water polo, men's and women's volleyball. We've got a number of Olympians that are in the Big West Conference, and that is those institutions are pretty much funding those sports, and that funds the Olympic movement. The Olympic USOPC, United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, does not fund anything from into our sport programs. We do not get any monies from the Olympic side, and our Olympic committee does not get any money from the U.S. government. So we are completely doing this based on the backbone of college athletics.
Which makes this discussion even more relevant to American sport, because if the conference system, the college conference system, disintegrates, that would have, you would think, a real flow onto your Olympic success.
Very much so. Yeah, if you've got conferences such as the Big West, the Pac-12 has been obviously a dominant in swimming and diving and some of those sports that the United States does very well in. If all of a sudden these sports are diminished, if the Pac-12 breaking up, now they go into 3 other conferences, potentially a 4th, with Washington State and Oregon State still determined where they're going to go or what they're going to do. What's the emphasis on swimming and diving in a conference such as the Big 10 or the Big 12 compared to the amount of emphasis they put in the Pac-12 conference on swimming and diving?
Just on that, Dan, and we're looking at some of those actions that are being taken, and you mentioned that one of them has been assessed as, if it was successful, it could cost more than $1 billion. What if that gets up? What are the consequences for the non-revenue sports, Title IX, things like that? The women's sports, where all that money is then going to go. Any of the money that's left is then going to be distributed amongst the elite athletes, if you like.
That is a challenge, Mark. And I mean, that's one of the biggest issues, I think, in front of the NCAA, and particularly institutions that don't have the higher resources. As these NCAA rules continue to change, I think you're going to start to see, if we don't get some, whether the NCAA can overhaul the model that can get everyone to agree to this newer model, or whether Congress or the legislature in the United States needs to get involved in it. I know the NCAA is asking for 4 major things from Congress right now, but the challenge is the United States Congress can't seem to get anything decided at this point. So it really is going to be thrown into the judicial system in many ways. But I fear and I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of sport programs cut, that you're going to see the footballs, men's and women's basketball, probably women's volleyball continue moving forward. But those sports that don't have any revenues coming in, that are really a cost for a lot of institutions, they're going to probably cut a number of these sports to try to better balance their athletic department expenditures and make sure that they can have sports. But to have 25 or 30 sports probably isn't going to be a model moving forward. The NCAA requires, I think it's 16 sports to be Division I. If all of a sudden they decided down the line here that you only have to have 12 or 8 sports to be Division I to try to help institutions across the country, I anticipate many Division I institutions across the country will look to go to that model.
And at least theoretically, isn't Title IX intended to address that very problem? That if you've got to say a university that's putting a lot of resources and making a lot of money out of football, and yet volleyball or lacrosse or gymnastics is not, is struggling to the point that they can't survive, isn't the theory of Title IX that the university has to allocate more resources to those floundering sports?
Generally, you need to be 50-50, Judge, you're correct, or at least have a percentage. If you have 60% of your student body is women, then you need to fund 60% of your sports, in equivalency in that respect. But how do you fund it, Judge, is the question. Is it a situation that you're funding it with scholarships and medical and meals and all the things that you get at the Division I level? Or again, you could choose to go to Division II or Division III, have lesser scholarships, and be able to, not have at Division III, you don't have scholarships. So you're providing sport opportunities on an equal basis, but it's really up to the student that wants to continue to play his or her sport to fund their own athletic endeavors. In many ways, they're paying for their tuition, their room and board, their meals. They may be able to get academic scholarships, but that was the threat years ago by the previous Big Ten commissioner, that if all of a sudden you have to start paying student athletes, we may just go to the Division III level. We may not pay for scholarships anymore. And I think that could be a threat that comes up, particularly if you're paying student athletes as employees. I think, Judge, that's where potentially scholarships go away. And now you're going to fund certain sports based upon what you can afford. Like the I hate to say the lunchroom person or the student that's working in the bookstore. You're going to pay a student athlete that same wage, and you're not going to be able to fund all sports at that level.
Well, it's certainly a watch this space, Dan, and I must admit I'm glad I'm not sitting in your seat at the moment.
Well, the interesting thing is the commissioners, the Division I commissioners are meeting in Chicago at the Big Ten offices in the week ahead, and then I'm going to Indianapolis the week after that for NCAA council meetings. I'm on the NCAA council, which is the 40 individuals from the 32 conferences. I represent 10 conferences as the non-basketball commissioner or non-football commissioner. I represent 10 conferences on this Division I council, but there's going to be a lot of decisions made, a lot of legislation put forth coming out of those meetings in October that the NCAA will be voting on in January. So I anticipate this group will be able to see a lot of articles, a lot of news written coming out of those meetings in October.
So when you talk about voting, Dan, and you're saying you're representing 10 conferences, do you have 10 votes?
I get one vote in the room for those 10 conferences. So it's literally take their positions, espouse, voice as much as I can the positions of us 10, because again, we don't have those football monies, and these conferences are the Big East, which I'm sure you've heard of the Big East.
Yep.
Atlantic 10 conferences, the Missouri Valleys, the West Coast Conference. Those are the conferences I represent, as well as the Big West in this meeting, in that group. So proud to represent them and proud to represent their voices.
Well, as I said, Dan, watch this space, and glad you're on the show so you can take us through it step by step.
It'll be fun, and it's always good to hear the questions coming from you guys. All
right, Paul, finals time for NRLW and the NRL. The NRL's been in finals for quite some time now, but NRLW semi-finals kicking off. But before we do that, I looked back at your predictions about the NRLW ladder that you gave us back at the start of the season 10 weeks ago, and you got 2 out of the top 4 correct.
Yeah,
the Knights and the Roosters.
It's almost a meatloaf song, wasn't it? 2 out of 4 ain't bad, but I've had a throw at the dartboard, but it is as our man Mark Fiorenzo would say, mouth-watering afternoon of women's football ahead, kicking off at 2 p.m. with last year's premier and the team that won the minor premiership, the Knights, up against the city of the moment in all codes, it seems, the Brisbane Broncos. I'm actually tipping the Brisbane juggernaut to continue. So all things Brisbane seem to be the flavour of the moment in Australian sports. So Broncos are outsiders with our friends the bookies, $2.40, but I actually think the Broncos will beat the Knights at 2:00 this afternoon. There's a couple of medical issues there with some of the players, and they've got the heart insignia on the jersey. I did tell anyone who'd listen, I thought the Brisbane Lions would win when Marcus Adams retired, and Fagan's speech was pretty powerful. So it's amazing what emotion can do, and I think emotion will carry the Broncos over the Titans at 2:00 as outsiders.
And the 4:15 game between the Roosters and the Titans?
Well, that's a cracking game as well. How long have we spoken on this show about we'd love a team from Gold Coast to do well? So it would be great to see the Titans make it into the grand final, but it's looking very unlikely. The Roosters are very short favourites. They were favourites to win it all last year, and forgive me, they were bundled out like your demons. I'm sorry, Professor, I didn't want to say that, but it just came out. They're hurting from that, as the Demons will be next year. I think the Roosters will be too strong for the Titans.
All right, Paul. And, of course, the 2 winners will play on grand final day next week.
Yes, and again, we've talked about this before. It's not that they're piggybacking on the men's game. There's an audience there ready to watch, and that'll be a massive game. Broncos against Roosters. You can only imagine all the Broncos fans that are there won't be able to wait to get there early and take their seat to watch the Brisbane women's team if they make it through. If not, you're going to have the Knights up against the Roosters, I think. And as we know, Newcastle's a very proud rugby league town. They couldn't quite get it done. The Knights on the men's side, but maybe again they'll go back to back on the women's side. But I just think the Broncos and Roosters will be the grand finalists.
All right, Paul, and we might digress, and I'll bring David here. David, the NRLW model versus the AFLW model. One where the games are all played at the same time, the other one where it's shifted around and you've got games at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Which one are you enjoying more of at the moment?
I think you'd be foolish if you didn't appreciate what the NRLW is actually doing for their game. Like as Paul said today, you've got two games that are at separate times. The number of clashes with the AFLW certainly doesn't help their brand. I think the other night, the game at Frankston, as an example, Professor, was moved because of the final that night. What it meant for the spectators on TV was that when the camera went to the right-hand end of the screen, you couldn't see anything because of the sunshine. So if it had been at the normal time, if it had been the night game, then you would have had the issue. But I think a couple of positives, I think the NRLW is a bit the same as well, is the fact that they're bringing games to the suburbs, which for me has been a disconnect with the AFL for a while. Is the suburbs not being utilised, and that goes for pre-season as well. But no, certainly I think the NRLW has done extremely well. And I think the other thing is that they've taken their time expanding and doing it properly. So if you look at next week, as Paul mentioned, the grand finals are both played on the same day. With the AFLW, the grand final for the AFLW is played, I don't know when it is. It's sometime, I don't know, November, is it, or something? Or so it just, I think we've discussed it ad nauseum about that. It's an afterthought at times, unfortunately, in the AFLW. Obviously, Professor, we're enjoying it at the moment, watching some pretty dominant performances from the Demons. But you're looking at teams that are just getting pulverised week in, week out. And is that good for the brand as well? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's almost to me as if the AFL's paranoid and petrified that anything will take away from the men's showdown, the big day. Whereas the NRL, I think it's embracing that it's one sport, and the cumulative effect of having the two on is going to lead to a better spectacle for those there. A lot of people will be there just much more interested in the women's event. So I think that adds to the men's event as well.
Paul, you raise a good point, because I think if you look at local football clubs, and I call them netball clubs, I should say, sorry, is that it's all played together. There's no separate seasons. There's no breaks, if that makes sense. They're all under the one banner. And I think from a sports perspective, it's been the biggest change to community grassroots sport has been the introduction of women's football. Obviously, the country did it a long time ago, John and Mark, that they had netball as part of their football club, and that was the involvement, and it adds such a dimension to your club. And I think we're seeing that now through the AFL or through AFLW with regards to the clubs. It brings different culture. I think it's been the greatest positive that we've seen in local sport.
Coutta, are we at a point now that we had, 9 or 10 seasons of the women's game being associated with the AFL? Can we now say it doesn't work? It might have been a nice idea to have St Kilda or Carlton to have the women's brand with them, but that's not how it's panned out. They don't play together. They're not associated. They've got the same jumpers and I suppose the same song, but they're actually two separate organisations. Whereas, as you say, the country, they're together, suburban, they're together. I've said it for a while. I think the better mix for the women's game would be the VFL.
Well, the VFL's obviously got VFLW a judge, so
I know, but just put all of that talent into the VFL and run it off, so they'll be on their parks. So it becomes like a park football. It's not playing in an empty MCG or an empty SCG or whatever. I think that VFL model, which is working well, would be better for all the elite, if we want to call it that, players to join into.
Yeah, I sort of think that I still think we've gone too quickly. That I think probably maybe pandered to the clubs a little bit, that all the clubs wanted a women's team. And obviously they did stagger it to a certain extent. But at the moment, yeah. And the other thing is that obviously great news during the week with the player agreement or the collective bargaining agreement with the increase of the funding or the wages and that for the female footballers. Still not where it should be, I don't think, but at the same time, it is an improvement on what they've had. If you put it at VFL, then you're going to be putting down another level as well. So if it went VFL, you're then going to have another layer. So I don't think it changes a lot, John, to be honest. And the other thing is, if you have VFL, can you have Sydney, GWS, all those ones involved? And do you think the VFL actually is working as well at the moment? So that state league that now encompasses Southport, the Lions, Suns, GWS, that's technically your reserves. And that's being played today. Werribee playing Gold Coast at Optus Park or whatever they call it. What is it called? Icon Park. So I just, and Nicole Livingston again, like she's the CEO, but like I don't necessarily know what she does for the league. I don't know what she does. Like at the moment, obviously we've got two CEOs in the men's game, which is one of the greatest fastest of all time. Gil and Dylan. But yeah, I think we've probably gone, as I say, I think we've gone probably too quickly. We've jumped, probably pandered to the clubs a little bit, and maybe not. The training wheels should have stayed on a bit longer.
All right, gentlemen, I might pull it up there, but at least, Paul, you can take some benefit from the NRLW. At least has a parity season where each team plays each other once, so you can't get any fairer than that.
They're doing it. The 2:00 game, I know Couta's talked before, Tamika Upton for the Knights is an excitement machine. And if you watch her and don't enjoy it, well, you're probably not going to enjoy Women's Rugby League. So it is a game that's producing some stars. And I'll use Tamika Upton as a segue into the NRL fast appearing best player in the game, Reece Walsh at the Broncos. Both of them are electric players who can create something out of nothing. But that Broncos team, I watched it with the kids last night. Reece Walsh is a star on social media. A big fan with the ladies, but I'm more interested in his football ability, and he's showing even more explosiveness, perhaps, than, dare I say it, Billy Slater in his early days. And he could be anything, Reece Walsh. So he's 20 years old, Professor. That's what everyone has to remember. And his buddy at number 6 in the spine, Ezra Mam, who's nominated as one of 3 Dalligan 5/8 of the year, is 21 years old. So those two players could create a dynasty for the Broncos. I know that's a bit rich given that we've got the Panthers sitting on a dynasty, but I'm very confident and very excited about watching these Broncos play.
Paul, Reece Walsh is a pretty good quarterback as well, isn't he, after what happened last night?
Yeah, he's got the 2-year-old kid as well, so he's getting his life in order. He really is a good player to watch, and he's got a bit of the cockiness of Jerome Luai. I meant to say Jerome Luai was a surprise inclusion, and he's come out with a medical diagnosis that his body is built differently. And he asked the reporter to tell the doctors that I'm built differently. So I don't know if that's arrogance or just living in his own little world, but perhaps he is a different physical specimen to the rest of us. We'd have to ask the Panthers medical staff maybe for a second opinion.
Physical or mentally?
Yeah, well, I think the second one, the jury's back on that. But apparently he heals quicker than others. So almost a superhuman, he's self-described. Whereas Reece Walsh, I think, has had some moments this year. He had a spray at a touch judge. He's had some outbursts, but he just plays with passion. And I think he's a lot more grounded than people give him credit for. We're going to have the grand final as a neutral, if you want to say that, that everyone wanted to see, because the Panthers are just almost impenetrable at times, the best defence. And then you've got the Broncos, the best attacking team. It's whether the Penrith Panthers will just grind the Broncos into submission, or whether the excitement machine that is the Broncos will win. But they absolutely towered the Warriors. Panthers did the same to the Storm. There's some real queries at the Storm. The bits and pieces forward pack that they tried to put out this year, Craig Bellamy's good, but he's not a magician. So the Storm are fading. I hate to say it, despite that very talented spine they've got.
Paul, one of the things the Penrith Panthers Storm game the other night is that the Storm played well probably for the first 15, 20 minutes. They had a back line that was cobbled together. Justin Olam looked like the shadow of his former self, and then they played Remus Smith on a wing. Now, they had 2 gilt-edged chances to score tries, which, again, may not have changed the way the game, well, the score, the way it ended, but it would have actually put some scoreboard pressure back on Penrith that they normally don't have. And you could see Bellamy get frustrated, but what happened after that was they bombed a try. They then gave up a cheap-ass penalty. And once you do that with Penrith, it's night over.
Yeah, someone put it best. It's so un-Storm-like. And I've watched the Storm live and on TV for 15 years. They used to be the team that did that to teams. And I'd see very good teams arrive at Storm Park and they'd be made to look like that, because the Storm would just grind you into submission. There really needs to be some soul-searching at the Storm. Bellamy put it best. He doesn't think the Panthers are getting better. They're just getting better at what they do. And that's not an oxymoron. It's simply that what they do, they've refined to such an art that it's like a tank. It just rolls over you. And they've got the flashy players, yes, but nothing on the electricity of the Broncos. I think the Broncos all round have enough explosiveness. They're the only team that could stop this juggernaut, the only team. And I'm glad as a neutral to be seeing it.
And obviously the other thing with the Storm, Paul, injuries hit them at the wrong time of year, and probably the unluckiest player in league, Ryan Pappenhausen, who, for those neutrals that just watch the game, he's someone that you just actually paid a ticket to go and watch.
Yeah, well, that's Reece Walsh stepping up into that. If Jerome Hughes hadn't been injured, Munster certainly hasn't had his best year. But it all comes back to that forward pack, which previous years, when there was Slater, Smith, Cronk, I mean, me and you could have played in that forward pack, Coutta, and we might have scratched out some wins because there was that much talent. And this spine, as good as they are, Jerome Hughes, Munster, Harry Grant, and Pappenhausen when he's there, they're not as good as those 4 players I mentioned, because they're a once-in-a-generation. And they were able to carry this, you have to say, with all respect, mediocre forward pack. But they lost the Bromwich brothers, they lost Kafusi, and I'm not saying they didn't realise that loss. They would have known, but the guys that were going to step up haven't, and that doesn't allow you superstars in the spine to play like they needed to challenge the top teams.
And then, Paul, obviously, the Broncos last year were looking to sack Kevy Walters. The supporters wanted him gone. It's amazing what happens when clubs don't listen to their supporters and stay with the process. And I think we're seeing it this year in the AFL with Michael Voss, everyone calling for his head. Memberships being microwaved, John, that's always a good trick, isn't it? But as soon as he was supported, I think the same with Kevy Walters, where he's now realising the dream of obviously coaching in a grand final.
Well, even you had players saying he's not a good coach. I still don't know what happened there with Selwyn Cobbo. Pre-season was saying Adam Reynolds coaches the team and Walters isn't a great coach. I think that was taken hopefully out of context or out of school. But I find that surprising because he's moulded this team into a superstar unit that's easily, well, it's in the top 2 teams and they may well win it all. So he's come a long way in just 1 year, and that's even amongst his players. So I'm sure if you ask Selwyn Cobbo now, he might want to take those comments back. And I'm sure that he's learned a lot this year by the coaching structure. Adam Reynolds, of course. Bellamy always said Cameron Smith is the best coach at the Storm. So you obviously, your on-field leader is a semi-coach. So that's perhaps more what Cobbo was trying to say.
Paul, in the grand final, sorry, Professor, in the grand final, and I'm not encouraging it, but would you actually go after Cleary? Like, he's the one that puts it all together. He's kicking game, he's passing, he makes the right decision probably 9 times out of 10. Would you actually go after him?
Well, he might be anatomically normal as opposed to Luai, so you might have a chance, because you're not going to obviously put a scratch on Superman if he recovers within days of a serious injury. So you're going to have to not necessarily go after. I know what you mean. You're going to have to muzzle Cleary and hope that you can keep Luai on the chain. And then you've just got to hope that Adam Reynolds, his kicking game is as good as Cleary on his best day. Reynolds has to have a great day. And the forward pack, you've got 2 of the best forwards in the Broncos team, in Haas and Carrigan. So they're up against a good forward pack, but they possibly have the 2 best forwards in the game, the Broncos. So they've got it everywhere.
All right, Paul. Now, we won't be on air before those 2 grand finals are played. So prediction time in the NRLW, who will win the grand final?
I think the Broncos will win it all over the Roosters.
And in the NRL, who will win the grand final?
And it's not a stuttering. And I think the Broncos will win it all against the Panthers.
So
it's going to be a big day for Brisbane, a very big day for Brisbane.
Oh, especially if the Bears win the day before as well. There will be sugar cane champagne flowing everywhere.
Dare I say it, will it become the sporting capital of Australia?
No.
Well,
for a weekend.
It won't be the Gold Coast, that's for sure.
Oh, cheap.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be an absolutely amazing game. And as much as I've loved what the Warriors have done, they've even eclipsed the All Blacks over there for popularity. I never thought I'd say that. And as much as I love the Storm living here, it is the 2 best teams, and they'll put on the best show. There's not going to be a blowout, I can assure you.
All right, Paul, thanks for that. Dan, you sent a link to a YouTube video with respect to concussion, following on Associate Professor Pearce's appearance on our last show, and was talking about the international consensus statement from concussion in sport. And perhaps you'd like to lead us off just with what the video was all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So a really good presentation, and fans here of the show can watch it. It's from the U.S. Council for Athletes Health. So it's uscah.com. U.S. Council for Athletes Health is the organization, and they had a presentation earlier this week entitled "Concussion Update: International Consensus Statement on Concussion in Sport." And I thought this was really interesting to share with the group. I wasn't able to watch it live, but was able to watch the recording that's available on their website. And it really tries to set up a strategy to assess the concussion, to get those that have concussions assessed correctly on the field, to make sure that they take the time to determine what, if they have a concussion, what grade of concussion is it, to communicate on the field with coaches, with medical personnel, the severity of the concussion. And then also they talked about how it's even possible, even though somebody may have a concussion and is ruled out of competing, they could get into aerobic exercise within 2 or 3 days after the concussion is, is the person is concussed in that respect. And then they've got what they call a scant, or it's a word test, that they assess the athlete on a day-to-day basis based upon word memory and some of the things associated with this concussion protocol, to determine when they are ready and clear to go back and participate in their sport. So it really is trying to establish international protocols for concussion management, concussion assessment, and return to play strategy. So it's about an hour-long presentation. Obviously, it focuses on concussions. So if you have an interest, it is something to watch. If you don't have an interest, there's a lot of medical information in it. But it was very interesting to hear the presentation from the athletic trainer side of things. And athletic trainers here in the States are the first line of defense for an athlete that gets injured on the field. And then they go into the sports medicine protocols from there. But Again, U.S. Counts for Athletes Health. It is not a government entity. This is an independent entity that was formed a few years back. Dr. Jim Borchers and Bob Sweeney and ATC formed the organization. I've worked with them now for 3 years. Crazy enough, since the COVID protocols and things, they helped me tremendously at the Big West with a number of medical things, but they really are an organization that sets out to be a third-party entity that can benefit any sport organization as to being a resource.
And one of the things that I took out of that was it's all focused around protocols and policies, which is obviously voluntary. Different sports are going to have different policies, and I mean, gridiron football to cheerleading, they're just going to have different policies. I didn't see that there's going to be any legislation. This seems to be done separately from government. As you say, it's not a government organisation. Is there any appetite, do you think, for legislation in America? Because we've just had a Senate inquiry in Australia about it, but I don't see any legislation coming out of it.
Yeah, I don't see any legislation here either, Judge. Again, we talked about just the things that are impacting college sport in general and the dysfunction of our current congressional system here in the United States not being able to make decisions. I can't imagine that they'll get into trying to legislate some type of medical entity. I mean, although you all know that there's been a lot of battles on abortion and things like that in our Congress and our legislature, but I can't imagine they're coming out with a concussion protocol across the country. I think this still kind of relies upon the best medical experts taking the best information that they can get and assessing correctly.
Okay.
One of the things that I took out of it, because I went and had a look at the actual consensus statement, and I was surprised that the AFL is currently working on a SCAT test, and we've all heard of that. And that's a SCAT 5. So SCAT is Sport Concussion Assessment Test. I didn't know that before. I heard people talking about SCAT. So currently the AFL work on a SCAT 5. Well, the consensus statement says, well, no, that's not good enough anymore. It's now got to be a SCAT 6. And so it's a harder test to pass. Now, the consensus statement came out in October last year. So the AFL is still using a test, or is using a test that has been said that isn't good enough at the moment. So I'll be interested to see if they change that for next season. The other thing I was interested, Dan, especially with ice hockey, I saw that there's a recommendation to disallow body checking for all children and most levels of adolescent ice hockey, which is really something that surprised me that they're so proactive. Now, I understand people on skates hitting each other, akin to a car crash, but to actually come out and say, well, look, there's a recommendation to disallow that.
I don't disagree with it, Mark, in that respect. I mean, to teach kids, obviously, hockey can be very violent sports, particularly when you're trying to push people into the dasher boards at full speed. Obviously, particularly younger kids, when you're talking about the dasher boards are likely at their height. Adults generally are going to get slammed into the glass more than the dasher board, but kids that age are going to get slammed straight into the dasher board, which is pretty much like hitting concrete in many ways. So taking that out of the game and teaching them more the finesse part of the game when they're young is probably a benefit to youth hockey than trying to teach a kid to be violent as a way to try to get the puck.
Yeah, it really is interesting to delve into those recommendations, because they've also asked or called for strategies limiting contact practice in all forms of American football. And I, knowing the coaches as I do in the NFL, how that would go down, probably.
Yeah, it's interesting how more and more they're pushing flag football. They're pushing non-touch type football here in the States. I know it's become a very popular women's sport and one that could be an emerging sport in the NCAA. Judge, as we talked about men's football, in college athletics at a Title IX level sport could be down the line here, flag football for women or some type of sport very similar in that respect. And, there's been a lot of emphasis, particularly the last 10 years in USA football, which is a governing body that's not known very well, but USA football has paid a lot of attention on trying to teach coaches, particularly youth coaches, high school coaches, how to teach tackling and, head up type tackling instead of head first type tackling. We've talked about that a little bit last week, how SportsCenter and ESPN really glamorized the head first tackling, the issues that really cause a lot of concussions that the guys in the NFL at the time, college football didn't realize were causing concussions. But as we know in the concussion space, helmet to helmet contact every time is jarring your brain. So again, trying to stay away from those levels of football, hockey, those type of sports where you're going head to head contact all the time is a good direction to go in the youth space.
Dan, just about of interest in mentioning ice hockey, top ice hockey players travel at over 50 kilometres per hour. Usain Bolt runs at 40. So you get two guys coming the other direction at each other. That's a serious collision.
Absolutely. Extremely violent. They say, Judge, the defensive player is more hurt than the offensive player because the defensive player is the one that knows exactly where he's going and going full speed at that direction.
Yep.
And of course, Judge, yesterday we did have the NHL in Australia at the moment. And they got into it yesterday. They took the helmets off and the gloves off and started belting living crap out of each other, which I just don't get it. It's such a bad look for this. I think it's a bad look for the sport. But
with two referees just watching there, I was wondering what they were waiting for to stop someone being knocked out. Or
I just couldn't believe, like, in this day and age when we're talking about CTE, concussions, look at the sport, etc., that it was being glamorised to a certain extent. So, Judge, one thing, obviously in the AFL 2 weeks ago, we saw Maynard's attempt to smother, knock out Brayshaw, and it created some real division amongst football people, amongst opposition supporters. I'm still today blown away by the fact that it occurred and the like, and then obviously they took it or they challenged it. Am I missing something or not?
No, I think that the AFL have made a mistake, and not only made a mistake, they're talking out of both sides of their face. That they say that they're serious about concussion, CTE. This proves they're not, and I like Professor's idea of strict liability in these matters. And if we're going to get serious about not just concussion but CTE, we know it exists. We know what causes it. A case like that should have gone to further appeal at the very least, and there should have been changes to ensure it never happens again. I know it's your team, but that's probably Brayshaw's last game, is it?
Well, I don't know.
He was badly hurt.
It was a shocking incident, and the fact he was knocked out for 2 minutes on the ground, it's a horrible look. And I've never ever seen a smother knock someone out before in my life, and I've watched a bit of footy. And I think Professor said it, as soon as you make the decision to jump, you can't control what happens. You are a catapult at that point, and it is going to happen. So don't tell me that he did all that he could to stop, and all the rest of it he didn't. And look how high in the air he is, the momentum he's got. It's going to have only one ending, and somebody's going to get very hurt, which is what happened. And Paul, on that with the rugby league at the moment, I think that they're becoming a lot more wary of hits on players, shoulder charges. The head high hit is something that's really being policed a lot more stricter than what it has in previous years.
If the Maynard incident happened in NRL, it's almost become strict liability. So whether you intended to do it, whether you could have pulled out or not, if you've hit someone like that, you would get suspended in the NRL. It's simply to stop players, unfortunately, doing that. And you could say, I think you put it best, once he jumped, it was out of his hands. And that's the uncertainty I think they're trying to get rid of in the NRL. Shoulder charges are out. Anything to the head is a penalty, if not send off or reported. So I think the only real possible defence is if someone's falling and you're going into tackle. But even then, head contacts are penalised.
And what needs to happen, I think we all agree on this, is the commentators and those reporting it have to stop using phrases such as back in the day, it's soft, all those things that put the players or make them sound as though they're not as tough. Now, we know that they're probably today they're tougher and harder than what they were in previous years because they're more physically dynamic than what they were back then. The players run faster, Judge. They run harder. They run up and down the ground the whole time, and they run to exhaustion.
They used to say State of Origin was 30% more aerobic capacity and intensity, but the club game has increased so much that they're at their peak, as you say, and at their limit. So it's bigger, faster, stronger. Everything is more professional and it's more brutal. So you've got to be, I think, more careful.
And that's why I think that's what's being missed, Paul, is the fact that this is where we're at and everything has to evolve and everything has to change as the game changes. And we're not. Pretty simple. I don't think we are anyway.
Well, gentlemen, I heard Paul say at their limit, and unfortunately for today, the discussion's been so good, we're at the limit of our time. So I'll just finish off with the Geldings tips because he gave them to me. He couldn't be here today. He's out lunching again. Flemington today, race 1, horse 4, Moya Lass. Race 5, horse 4, Served Cold. Race 6, horse 5, Apulia. And race 7, number 7, Crackerjack Prince. And he says that's coming off him tipping 50% win and place yesterday. So he's in pretty good form. And I'll thank you all, gentlemen, for your participation today. And Judge, we'll hold the discussion of the chairman of the AFL and his chair role in other organisations over until the next show.
That's fine, Mark. And can I just talk about a worrying trend? Paul Dalligan's Zing account is in single figures this week, and I'm a bit concerned he's getting us to become a serious young man in his old age. And,
I'll try and remedy that. Race 1, I've actually been tipped a horse. I'm not making this up, and it's called Speak. It's race 1 at Flemington. So there's one for you. So that's an omen.
Well, definitely.
You can't listen with your lips moving. Someone said to me once. So that could be my omen tip for the day.
Well, thanks for your participation today, and we'll see you all at the next show.